I'm Dan Bablocki. You are listening to Our First Fears, a podcast about gateway horror, past and present, with creators currently working in the genre. Today's guest, New York Times bestselling author Tracey Baptiste, decided to surprise me with her first fear, withholding the topic until we recorded, which made it slightly difficult for me to prepare for our chat, but also made it a whole lot of fun. I won't reveal her fear to you just yet, but I will mention that during our talk, we get into many aspects of the folk tales from her native Trinidad and Tobago, particularly the very frightening Jumbies of Caribbean legend. We discuss the secret things that hide inside the stories we write, and how tales of monsters help keep people in line and also reveal our biases. Tracey Baptiste is the writer of many, many books for young readers and adults, covering both fiction and nonfiction, including the New York Times bestseller Minecraft: The Crash, The Jumbies, Rise of the Jumbies, and The Jumbie God's Revenge. The content warnings are now in the show notes, so if you like, check those out before listening. Now, turn down the lights, turn up the volume, and get ready to explore Our First Fears. Hello, Tracey Baptiste. How are you?
Hi, Dan. I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good. It's so exciting to have you on the podcast today. We were just talking before we started recording, and I said that I'm intrigued because you're the first guest on the show who has sort of refrained from telling me exactly the fear that you want to discuss. So I'm a little bit nervous and very much excited. But for the guests, before we get into all of that, could you give a brief introduction to yourself, your work, and maybe what your relationship to the horror genre is?
Sure. First of all, thank you for inviting me to do this. I think it's like a really intriguing thing to delve into. So, and obviously, like, I like having a lot of fun with the things that I do, which is why I didn't want to tell you.
Yes, I get it.
Because that's a lot of fun for me, but also, like, I think makes the whole thing more exciting. So my name is Tracey Baptiste, and I am a writer who I think it's hard to categorize me in a lot of ways because I write from picture books all the way up to young adult. I write both fantasy and nonfiction. I've written realistic fiction. I've written, what some would consider in the horror genre. I also write graphic novels. There's a really wide range of ages that I write for, and also kind of a wide range of topics and things that I take on as an author. I also write for adults, but we're not here to talk about that. And I think that probably the best things to know about me and where I come from is that I was born in Trinidad and Tobago. I grew up there. And so a lot of the storytelling traditions that kind of inform my writing really come from those oral traditions, and the ability to do extempo, which is like basically just like take any topic and make a story and make something out of it on the spot. So that's what I grew up with. So
I
it's
love
not
that.
Yeah, so it's not really, I don't think, a big surprise knowing that, understanding what it is I do now in my life. And then I also was a classroom teacher for many years before I started writing full time. And I think the way that I come to the horror genre really is through fairy tales. I was obsessed with fairy tales as a kid, and fairy tales, as you know, are quite gruesome. And the Caribbean version of fairy tales are Jumbie stories. Jumbies are creatures that come out at night. They mostly want to kill you, eat you, do bad things to you. And during the day, they look like literally anybody. So, as a
Mm.
child growing up in Trinidad, like the next door neighbor might be a Jumbie. I didn't
Hmm.
know, because, during the day she was like all fine and well, or he was all fine and well, or whatever. But
Mm.
at night, like that person could like come around and try to eat me. So that's what I grew up with. And I super loved this idea. Like it was very intriguing to me, this sort of duality of existence, and the idea that people could be hiding like sort of hidden
Yes.
selves and stuff like that was very, very intriguing to me as a
I'm
kid.
super intrigued by that concept.
Yeah, yeah. So I super love that. Yeah, I think that's really how I come to the horror genre. It really has more for me to do with sort of unseen things, things that need to be discovered, rather than these are things that are going to scare you.
Yeah.
It's really like about uncovering stuff.
Yeah. So it's not about finding the scares, it's about finding truth, right? For
Yes.
you? That's,
Yeah.
yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
And I like that it turns into, for the rest of us who are reading your stories, scary stuff
Right.
sometimes. Yeah. So the second question that I'm asking all the guests is, do you recall the first time you ever felt frightened?
Yes. So when you reached out and you said that this was what we were going to be talking about, I was super excited because this is a thing that I have in like more recent years been thinking about a lot. So my first recollection was as a toddler living in Trinidad. We were still living in our like sort of smaller bungalow house. It was in a village in the south of Trinidad where like literally everybody knew each other. And I remember at the time I was old enough that I could like sort of do stuff on my own, but young enough that I was not ready for school yet. And so my mom and my dad were at work. My brother was at school, and I was at home with the nanny. And of course, as a baby, I don't really remember the nanny that much. I sort of remember just being in the house by myself, which was never the case, right?
Right.
That's the thing that I remember. And I remember, like the windows open. We had these louvered windows and they were all open. And all of a sudden, the curtains started like blowing. And I remember looking out the window and the sky was turning this really dark, steely gray.
Mm.
And I could see that there was a storm coming. And I obviously, it's Trinidad's tropical country, obviously must have experienced rain and storms and whatnot before. But then all of a sudden, there was this horrible, huge rumble in the sky.
Mm.
And I had no idea what that was. It was like the sky was like yelling at me. It was deep, it was long. And I just remember standing there looking through the window, trying to figure out what this thing was. But I was absolutely terrified. And I think too terrified to even cry or anything. Like, I was just kind of like frozen in that spot. I think the reason that that sort of really super resonates as my first scare, this idea of thunder sort of like coming towards me, is because at the time we had a dog named Thunder.
Oh.
And not long after that experience, Thunder went to the dog farm.
Oh. Wait, not
And
long after that experience?
I think it might have been after or it might have been before. but it was right around that time. And, like when I was first thinking about it, I thought, oh, I think thunder went to the dog farm before I actually experienced thunder. And that's why it was so significant. But now I'm sort of recalling, I think it might have been after. But regardless, whether it happened just before or just after, I kind of associate this experience of sort of recognizing Thunder for the first time with my dog Thunder and the fact that he suddenly was no longer there. And I was 100% told that Thunder went to a farm where he would have more place to play and whatnot. Of course, it was many years later that I realized what actually happened to Thunder. But I associate that first memory of my experience of Thunder with my dog and the loss of that dog. But yeah, it is the very first memory that I have of being really scared.
That is fascinating on so many levels to me. First of all, I think it's interesting. I've been having these conversations. This is a weird thing to admit to you right now, but I've been having these conversations, and probably because I'm talking to a lot of people about their first fears. But the idea of children starting to understand mortality and even their own mortality. And this memory of yours definitely touches in on that, I feel like. Do you feel like it was a moment where you might have questioned your own place in the world, and maybe how thinking about your dog Thunder, did it make you wonder about yourself, do you think?
I think, it's funny. I don't know that I was so much interested in myself and my place or my space within whatever it was that was happening. I was more interested in what it was about this sound that related to my dog.
Mm.
That's the thing that I was kind of trying to figure out. Like, was he sad? Was he angry? Why would he make such a big sound? He'd never made a sound like that before. I feel like those were the things that I was trying to figure out. It really did not occur to me that Thunder had died at that time or even long afterwards, right? It really took me quite a long time to figure that out. So I don't think that's the thing that I was considering, but it was sort of like he had become something else entirely, right? He had been this dog, little white dog. Well, actually, he was pretty big. He was not little. I mean, I was, and also as compared to me, he would have been big because I would have been very small. But he had sort of become this other thing, right? And given that, I was starting to hear these stories about people who might be other things.
Yes, I was just going to say, yeah.
Like, it did not really seem kind of out of the ordinary that maybe, okay, well, the dog is not quite the dog anymore. The dog is this other thing. But I also remember, not at that time, but sort of later on, I remember coming to kind of enjoy the sound of thunder. Like, a lot of kids are really scared by the sound of thunder. And I remember kind of liking it because, there was Thunder again, who I knew. Like, I knew this guy, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Oh, you're like, I know him.
exactly. So I had that relationship where I was just like, yeah, it's this big scary thing. Like I know from the first time, it like really scared me. But like now I know, like it's just thunder.
That's some really cool magical thinking, right?
Right?
I love that kids can do that. I love that you turned the fear into something that was recognizable to you, and also maybe could have been a protecting kind of element to you. Like, Well, I don't know about the rest of you kids, but I know thunder.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. That's exactly what it kind of became. And I think, you know, for the rest of my life, really, I kind of leaned into this idea of transformative beings, the
Mm,
idea that, things are never really quite what they seem, and that you need to like figure out what things are at their essence. Like, I feel like that is has been a thread that has followed me since. And when I say things like that, I think that's when people understand why it is I write fantasy and nonfiction, and they
mm,
feel very much a piece. Because for me, it really just is about like examining a thing and figuring out how it works, where it comes from, why it does the things that it does. It's also why I'm like super interested in science.
mhm,
I haven't published any like science books under my own name, but I did at one point work at Rosen Publishing. And one of the things I did was edit science books, which I very, very much enjoyed. I loved doing that. And I do intend to write more science and publish them under my own name at some
mhm.
point. And for me, it is all a piece. It is all the same kind of work. It is all the same kind of examination. Like figuring out a thing. How does it
Yeah,
work? What is it? What is it really? Like, it looks like this, but is that really what it is? Let's like go deeper. Let's
yeah.
dig it all the way down to its core and figure it out.
It's fascinating to think that from the way that you are approaching work, looking at things and examining them, that even if you were to write a nonfiction book about science or a particular element of science that could turn into a scary story simply by the nature of what it is that you're examining. It's the same thing with the Jumbies. Like maybe they're inherent are they inherently scary, or like, like that's one question that I had for you. But the idea of looking at something and finding all elements and facets of what make it up reveal whether it is something that can scare you, that can give you like an existential fear, a jump scare. I don't know. Like I remember science class. This is an embarrassing story as well. Year 10, I think it was. I was in chemistry, and my teacher had said something about, here's this compound. When you put it in water, it'll make the water boil. I can't remember what it was. I was not a good science student. And he said something like, now it'll make the water boil, but be careful because if it sticks to the glass, it will superheat the glass and it will explode.
Right.
And if somebody out there is listening and they know what this compound is, please write to me and let me know, because I can't remember. But I remember my class, we were all surrounded around this experiment thing. The water started to boil in this beaker, and I saw the compound sort of edge toward the glass, and it was like leaning against the glass too much. And all of a sudden, like jump scare, I thought it was going to explode, and I fell back into my classmates like a bowling ball, and like just as if to protect myself from an explosion of glass to the face. I don't know. I think that's funny that an ordinary kind of classroom situation that is so benign all of a sudden scared the crap out of me.
Right.
So,
Glass to your face is pretty scary.
yeah. And the teacher did set me up, right? I feel like
Yeah.
there was something to that setup
Yeah.
where
100%.
I don't know, maybe he did want all of us to fall over, but I was the only one who fell for it.
That actually sounds very much like a thing that I would have done as a teacher. I'm sorry to tell you. Like, I loved stuff like that where, like the kids were like super interested in the thing and they're like super paying attention to what's happening because you set up an expectation, and then, like either that expectation gets fulfilled or it doesn't get fulfilled. But regardless, there's a reaction. If it
Mhm.
gets fulfilled, there's a reaction. If it doesn't get fulfilled, there's a different kind of reaction. But we also do that when we do stories, right? Like we
Exactly.
we set up things, And then we either make sure that that thing happens or we do a fake out, which is a very different kind of plot point. And we sort of send the reader in a different direction. So it's like, it's kind of this thing. Like, it would not be interesting. You would not have remembered it if that teacher hadn't set you up.
Oh, yeah. Do you feel like there's a correlation between being a teacher, an educator, and being a storyteller?
For me, there definitely is. I am always playing a long game, I feel, in my work. So I feel like anytime I approach some piece of writing, there is something beyond the story that I am trying to communicate to the reader. It is always something that I am sort of struggling with in my own life, like certain ideas, and they're usually very philosophical or very political. And then I find ways to infuse those into the story so that a young reader might not notice this on a first reading, or even a second, or even a third. But it's something that I like to embed in there so that much, 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 much later on, they have some foundational information for something that they experience later on in their lives. And they might not even realize that it came from one of the books that they read. So, for example, in the Jumbies, the thing that I was really trying to explore there was the idea of an indigenous culture being displaced
Mm-hmm.
by a new culture,
Mm-hmm.
but also the idea of how people fear things that come from different places, especially places that are in darker or in shadows,
Mm-hmm.
and how people fear that without trying to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I was playing with in the first Jumbies book. The second one, obviously, that one gets very much into the transatlantic slave trade. The third one, the thing that I was playing with mostly was sort of climate refugees, like what happens when the weather kind of like turns against you and you no longer have a home. Like, what does that look like? Like, that's the thing that I was playing with there. In Mermaid and Pirate, the thing that I was thinking about was the border crisis and people coming across the border and not having language to communicate with somebody else. And I mean, Mermaid and Pirate is like this tiny little picture book that feels like a rom-com. But the thing that really spurred it was the border crisis. And of course, that's nowhere in the book, right? But that's the thing that I was thinking about. How do you communicate and communicate well and show kindness to somebody who does not have the same language as you and comes from a different place? That's the core of the thing.
That's the truth.
Right. Yeah. So I'm always coming at something with intention and wanting to leave a reader with something to think about. And that 100% comes from teaching and wanting to imbue certain philosophical ideas on kids so that they can think about it, not so that they can feel what I feel or think what I think, but just so that they have some foundational information for themselves so that when they come across it in real life, they have some foundation with which they can think through that for themselves. And that is 100% how I was as a teacher. And it absolutely is what I do as a writer.
Wow, that's awesome. It's got to be a special skill too, in that you are not necessarily presenting the issue or the problem, but you are presenting the idea behind the issue or the problem. And I think that's pretty cool to be able to create a compelling story in that way as well. I kind of want to jump back a little bit and ask you, can we talk about Jumbies?
Yeah.
I'm curious, growing up in Trinidad and Tobago, it must have been second nature, these Jumbie stories, the folklore. But do you remember your own experience finding these stories or growing up with them? Like, how was it being a child growing up with these Jumbie stories? And what do you remember about that?
There's two parts to that. When I was a kid growing up, people talked about Jumbies like they literally could be anybody. So this was part of like regular conversation. Like people would talk about whether it's sunny or rainy outside. Like
Yeah.
it was just regular. So, for example, my uncles, my mother's brothers, were significantly younger than her, but older than my brother and I. So they were teens when my brother and I were like really little kids. And they were teens who were dating girls, right? And so there would be a lot of teasing about whether or not their girlfriends might be a Laja Bless or a Sukubo
Wow.
or something like that. And it was just like teasing them, right? And it was like all a joke. And even though these were creatures that were so scary or whatever it was, because the approach was teasing, because the approach was, oh, ha ha ha, isn't that funny? Maybe you'll be dead in the back of a car. You better watch out for this girl. Like, does she always wear long skirts? Like, you need to check to make sure that she doesn't have one foot that's a cow hoof. Like,
Right.
because it was like this big, funny kind of tease, it felt very alive to me
Yeah.
as a little kid. And I would look at people and wonder whether or not they were like regular or they were a Jumbie. And I talk about this all the time. My grandmother's next door neighbor, Miss Evelyn. Anybody who has ever heard me talk about Jumbies has heard me talk about poor, God rest her soul, Miss Evelyn, who, when I was really little and would sleep over at my maternal grandmother's house, Miss Evelyn lived next door, and I would get up in the morning and I would have bites like all over my body. And I would wonder if Miss Evelyn was a sukuya, because that's what they do. They come around, they suck your blood at night. And it did not matter whether or not anybody told me that it was mosquitoes or not. I was sure that it was Miss Evelyn, because grandma wouldn't close the window, because she wanted me to have some nice night breeze in the bedroom, and Miss Evelyn's window was open and I could see it from my window. And that is how the sukuyas get in. And grandma was not throwing out her good rice to put on the floor, which is how you stop a sukuya. Grandma was not going to do that.
Why? Why wasn't she going to do that?
Well, also my grandma was kind of mean. Particular grandma was like super mean grandma. So yeah, she was not like pouring out her rice for me so that the sukuya would stop to have to count the rice. This is how you stop a sukuya.
Yes.
They're like, like they're obsessed with counting, and they have to like count all the rice, and then it takes them all night, and then they go back home because they got to put their skin back on. Anyway, grandma would not pour out rice for Miss Evelyn. She was not wasting her good rice on me being afraid of mosquitoes, she said.
Okay.
But I was pretty sure it was Miss Evelyn. And I mean, for a long time, I thought Miss Evelyn was a sukuya. Like, I mean, for like a crazy, crazy long time. She scared the ever-living daylights out of me. So, yeah. So, like that was the atmosphere.
Can you describe Miss Evelyn? Like,
Miss Evelyn was beautiful. Like she really was a lovely lady. She was a little bit heavy. She was very buxom. I never really saw her wear anything except for like her house dress, which is sort of like a shift, like sort of a, like a sort of a, like really like a step above a nightgown. I never really saw Miss Evelyn wear anything but that. Because she always seemed to be home. She never seemed to like go out, like and do things.
Okay. So you as a child were very observant and paying attention to like Harriet the Spy, like kind of looking at the neighbors and sort of.
Sure. Also, we were kind of, especially when I was still living in Siparia, which is the village. Before we moved into the city, we moved up to the city when I was 8. So this is all pre 8 years old. We were kind of feral because it was such a small village, and because both my mother and my father's families were both from Siparia. So I had all of my cousins, all of my aunts and uncles, absolutely everybody living in this small village. So we literally could go anywhere we wanted. So long as we were old enough to like cross the street and stuff, we could go anywhere we wanted. and do whatever we wanted because there was always somebody around who knew you,
Mm-hmm.
who you could go to if you like fell down and skinned your knee or something like that. There was somebody right nearby. So it was me and my little band of cousins running around this town
Mm-hmm.
by ourselves for the most part. I mean, granted, there was probably an older uncle who was probably a teen or something like that who was sort of with us, but it never felt like we were being supervised in
Mm-hmm.
that kind of way. It kind of felt like we were like out on our own, climbing trees, picking plums or cherries. Like we would sit up in the trees for hours, just sitting up there eating fruit.
That's
And people
incredible.
just kind of knew where you were or whatever. And then we would like go to somebody's house and like eat lunch, like whoever was closest. I don't know.
Yeah.
And then you'd like find yourself back home. And or if you were like too far and it's too far for you to walk by yourself, like somebody would send somebody to like walk you back home, like an older kid to like walk you back to your house. And it was all of the houses were within walking distance. And we just kind of had the run of the place and we would just be everywhere like doing whatever. So, like we were paying attention because we had to know where everything was and what was happening and where we were going and where all the stuff was, and we kind of knew like where the good fruit trees were and who was the sort of mean neighbor that you needed to like run past their house super quick so that they wouldn't like look at you too hard because again
Mm-hmm.
they could be chippy. I don't know.
Yeah.
So like that was my life, pre 8 years old growing up. Like it was very much like that. We were just out all the time
Mm-hmm.
doing whatever.
I feel like there's something about, because I had a similar kind of experience in my Rhode Island little neighborhood where we had our places to go. We had our roots. We had our trees where we would climb and we would hide. But the idea of a childhood map of your area, I think is fascinating. I would love to see a book or something of like writers or creative people or artists childhood maps and the backways through the woods and the trails that lead to that one spot that everybody knows about, and stay away from so and so's house because scary.
Yeah. Oh my God, so many backways, so many little alleyways that you could only get through because you were that small, right? Like
Yeah.
that sort of situation where you're just small enough to be able to get through this particular like crack between these two walls. The adults cannot do it.
Mhm.
So you can do it and like be very happily like going through this area. Like that is 100% a thing that used to happen. Or even like we would have like these little creeks and stuff like that with like somebody just put a board across it, right? And because you were small enough and light enough, you could traverse that. An adult could not because they would break it, but you could do it. It was just for you.
I don't know if you've used this in anything, but there's an adventure story in this nugget of an idea here.
Oh yeah, but I mean, a lot of this sort of feeling of being feral and having like an island to myself, I
Mm,
put into the Jumbies series. Like, there's a
yeah,
lot of that in there. Obviously, there's like way more to explore. I mean, I got material for years and
I
years and
bet.
years
I bet.
with this book. But yeah, like anytime I try to do an adventure where there are younger kids who are kind of off on their own, that's the same kind of feeling that I am recalling is, this band of my cousins and me just out in the world doing whatever pretty much by ourselves with clearly obviously there was like some adults around sometime with their eyes
Yeah.
or eyes, right? But like it
Yeah,
never
like as kids we never really saw,
exactly. Yeah, like we're so
behind the
not
scenes.
into them. Yeah, they could not have been far,
Yeah.
right? They could not have been very far because there's no way. I know for sure, like my parents would never let me just, run around the whole of Siparia by myself. obviously there was like some responsible person around, but I never recognized who
Yeah.
that was or noticed them or paid any kind of attention to who that was.
The idea of safety for children and rearing children and parenting children, connecting to folklore, I've always been fascinated by. So much of folklore, I feel like, has been invented to not only entertain or not entertain, that's not the right word. It's been invented to kind of warn kids, like stay away from the river bank, or
Yep.
Jenny Greenteeth is going to come out and get you, or
Right.
don't go into the dark part of the woods at night because any number of the
Yep.
Jumbies that you have mentioned could be hiding there and want to eat you.
Yep.
I'm intrigued by that. And I'm drawing a connection to that idea and also the idea of a Jumbie could be your neighbor,
Right.
right? Is there a warning there, do you think? Did that idea create schisms in the village or in people's relationships? Or was it more about like what you mentioned, teasing, like Ledja Bless
Yeah.
being your cousin's new girlfriend?
Right. So I think that there's two parts of it. So anytime I'm talking about the Jumbies with an older group of kids, like if I go into high school and people want me to talk about it, one of the things that we talk about first is the sukuya. So the sukuya is always an older woman in the village. She often lives in a house by herself. Usually it's at the edge of the village. Miss Evelyn did not live at the edge of the village. She lived right in the middle of the village, but she was an older woman who lived by herself. And this idea that a woman who was on her own and had economic stability on her own and independence could be a monster was something that
Yes.
comes directly from the patriarchy. And
Yes.
so that is a thing that I talk about with older kids, like this idea that this woman who doesn't need a man, who can live on her own, who's happily, like taking care of herself and all of her things, there must be something wrong with her is one of the ideas that come out of this. But also when you think about La Jablesse, you're thinking about a woman who is walking along the street at night alone,
Mm-hmm.
right? Either she's looking for something, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
or she's looking to do something bad to you. Like she is either a temptress or she is a threat, and the La Bless is both.
Mm-hmm.
She is both a temptress and a threat. So the Laja Bless lures handsome young men and then drags them to their death, often over the side of a cliff. So when you say, hey, your girlfriend might be a Laja Bless, you are making commentary about that girl, about whether or not she is a threat or she is a temptation in an unsavory kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these stories really come from people's biases, from people's fears, people sort of putting their own negative ideas onto these stories. And they do kind of work as warnings, right? So you want to tell young men when they're going out to like watch out for these kinds of ladies, because you want to sort of keep the young men out of difficulty or whatever it is. But even like with, like, for example, the Lagahu is this man who's like, comes around, he's on his own. He like comes out at night and he has like these chains around him, like you need to be careful of him. So it all kind of operates as a warning. I think the Duen is the most sort of warning towards children because
Ooh.
they're little, they've got backwards feet, they
Ooh.
call you. You're supposed to answer them in a certain way so that they don't know how to respond to you so that you can stay inside. I mean, the Duen is like the most obvious keep a child inside the house kind of situation.
Yeah.
But all of the Jumbies come from these stories that have been created by people who have biases, who have these thoughts in their head that they are trying to put on anybody who they're seeing doing something that maybe is not quite the norm, or they don't feel should be the norm, or whatever it is. Like it is all very clearly a particular agenda.
Yeah.
Um, and then the other idea is that you don't want to be accused of being a Jumbie, right? So then you yourself stay in line so that somebody does not say something like that
Oh my
to you.
God.
Yeah.
Wow. Yes. I was going to ask you earlier if there is a political element to Jumbie lore, but I think you just answered my question.
Oh yeah. Well, not that recently actually, but I want to say like maybe 6 or 7 years ago, there was a big kerfuffle in Parliament in Trinidad because one of the parliamentarians called somebody else a lagahoo. And it was just people, it was on the news. People were so angry. People were so upset. Like it was so rude. And I was shocked that this was still happening in the 21st century. I'm like, really? Are we still doing this? This is crazy. But yeah,
Wow.
that was like a real thing that happened in politics, like these two political rivals going at each other.
That is fascinating. I don't even know what to say. It's because I feel like, in this country, politics are so inflammatory right now.
Right. Yeah.
I wonder,
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a correlation between what one politician could say to another that would be that upsetting and would make the news. At this point,
Yeah.
anyway, like because
Right.
it's
Right.
insults and all that stuff are so common at this point. But
Right.
can you
Yeah.
imagine calling somebody what was that they called them? The
Lagahoo.
lagahoo, yeah, incredible.
Where did you even remember this language? Like, where did that pull out of? It was hilarious. I
That
mean,
is funny.
I thought it was so funny. My mother was beyond shocked. She was so shocked and appalled and angry, and I was just peeing my pants with laughter.
Well, it is you kind of do have to laugh at the politics and the politicians sometimes because
Oh,
they're
sure.
entertainers. They're entertainers in a
Yeah.
lot of ways, and they know that they can get a reaction by saying stuff like that.
Yep.
I don't want to make this all about Jumbie folklore, but I just have a couple more Jumbie questions for you, and
Sure.
then
Sure.
we can move on. So, Severine in book one
Yes.
of
Uh-huh.
of the Jumbies, you mentioned maybe that you had invented the
Yes.
idea of her. Did you
Yeah.
fear? Was there kind of a superstition or fear of inventing a Jumbie, putting it into a
No,
book?
because I think, at the time that I was writing the very first book, the first Jumbie book, I mean, I had already had several books out by then. I had a realistic fiction novel out that like nobody read. I'd written several nonfiction books at that point, and then I was working on the Jumbies. And to be honest, I didn't think anybody was going to read this.
What?
I really thought, I remember having a marketing meeting with Algonquin, and they were like, "So, who do you think is going to read this?" And I'm like, "My mom and her friends,
Oh my God!
and like maybe some of my friends." And that was it. So the idea of creating Severine did not really concern me because I didn't think anybody was ever going to see it. And so, like, I would never have to answer questions about inventing a whole new Jumbie because, like, who cares? Like, I was writing this book for like 20 people. So, what was the big deal? I think that if I had understood at all how popular this book was going to be, that might have given me a lot more pause than
Mhm.
it did. But as
Okay.
it was, I was just like, well, I kind of need one creature to sort of be kind of like the big bad. And there isn't something like that in the Jumbies. Every Jumbie is sort of on their own, doing their own thing, and you really don't see Jumbies interact. They're usually like off. Like it's just a Jumbie down here and another Jumbie over there, or whatever it is. So the idea even of having them all be together was again, something new. And then Severine was just created because I needed to have somebody who was like one. But also, I did not know that there would be sequels. We sold this book as a standalone,
Mm-hmm.
and did not think that there would be interest in sequels at all. So Severine worked really well for book one. For book two, not so much. So I had to like create a whole other set of magical hierarchies and whatnot to make Severine work for all three books. Like,
Wow.
if I knew that it was going to be a 3-book series, there would not have been a Severine because she complicated things so much for me for a book two and a book three. I mean, obviously, I got it to work out, but it was really hard to figure out like how I was going to do that because she doesn't really translate. But like you see her, she transforms in every book. Like she transforms for book two. She has to transform again for book three because as she is in book one, it just doesn't work
Mm-hmm.
going forward. So I just make her like this sort of transformative creature so that for every other book, like I can remake her so that
Yeah.
she fits in.
Do you work? Because I in my own writing, like in the first book that I ever wrote, I use the folklore of Lilith from, I don't know, the Gnostic texts of the early Bible or whatever. And as I looked back on that book in particular, I kind of and learned more about Lilith after I had put that book out into the world. I sort of was like, did I conjure something bad? Is that a worry for Severine? Like, I know there's an oral tradition here.
Right. Yeah.
Do you worry that you've created a new monster out in the world?
No, I don't. I think because a lot of how I think about Jumbies comes from a place of humor.
Mhm.
I don't really worry about it. I mean, for me, it is just play.
Yeah.
And even when I go to schools and I do school visits, one of the greatest pleasures for me is when some kid inevitably asks me if Jumbies are real.
Mhm.
And I say, that is a good question. And then I just move on to whatever's the next question.
See, that's the teacher you're messing with them, and you were my science teacher trying to bowling
Yeah,
ball the student.
right. So I love that because then they're like, I don't have the answer, right?
But that also, I love that you do that because it also it's about magic and mystery, and that's what you're creating when you're creating these kinds of books.
Exactly. Yeah. But I also, especially if they're having me come and they want to talk about Jumbies, one of the things that I do is I introduce not all of the Jumbies in the sort of pantheon of Jumbies, but I introduce a few of them and I let kids come up and do improv. And so they like pretend to be that Jumbie so they can understand how that Jumbie works and how that Jumbie thinks. And then I have them like choose one of their friends that they could kill. Um,
I can't.
they come up, and sometimes I have costumes and sometimes not. Sometimes it actually works better without the costumes. Like, interestingly, they sort of weirdly get more into it if they don't have the costumes. It's very funny. So they'll come up and I'll like, either get them dressed or sort of like prep them to like be this Jumbie and they understand how this Jumbie works and whatnot. And of course, we're doing this in front of the audience. So like everybody's hearing this and everybody's getting prepped. And then they are that Jumbie. And then I'm like, great. And so now choose a friend of yours that you want to kill. And then the friend comes up and then the friend has to like learn the various things that you can do to like prevent this Jumbie from killing you. And then the two of them go at it. And it's like this whole little improv thing. And I don't know what's going to happen. Like maybe they'll die. Maybe they won't. I don't know. That's up to them at that point. I just stand back.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
It's so much fun for everybody because they really remember what the Jumbies are. They really remember like the things that you need to do to protect yourself from a Jumbie. everybody has a great time. And then when I get the question, are Jumbies real? And I say, that's a really good question. And I move on. And then somebody like will inevitably come back and say, but you didn't answer the question. And I'll say, listen, but I've taught you all of the things that you need to know to protect yourself. So you don't need to worry about it because you know what to do to protect yourself. So you're good. And I still don't answer the question. I just move on.
Because that's the point, isn't it? That's
Right.
the point of these stories. Learn the rules, learn what you can do to survive.
Right.
And just like any life lesson.
That's right. And then you move on. Like you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what you're going to encounter. It is all a mystery. You just don't know. But I also, go through the whole process of telling them, that, a Jumbie could be anybody during the day. Like it could be the teacher. It could be the librarian. It could be the bus driver. You just don't know. So here are all the things that you can do to protect yourself. Are they real? Who knows? Goodbye. I'm leaving.
Before we say goodbye, I wanted to ask you, you had a book come out in 2021 called Looking for a Jumbie, a picture book illustrated by Amber Wren.
Yes.
I'm curious about how does one approach telling a scary tale for the picture book audience?
Yeah, that took quite some time to figure out because, of course, it can't be creatures that will come out at night and eat small children, right?
Yeah.
But I had been challenged by a lot of really little kids to write a book about Jumbies for them. And a lot of that pressure came directly from my family and very tiny cousins and little cute babies in my family who would literally hold up the like the sort of older kid version of the Jumbies and be like, Auntie Tracy, can you write one but for me? I got so many pictures and little videos and things like that. And also when the second Jumbies book came out, that cover with Mama Jalou on the cover, it's so gorgeous and so appealing that there are a lot of really little kids who grab it and like want it. And I'm like, you cannot read this, kid. Like, yeah. I am sorry. So it took me years to figure out how to translate it. And the translation really was in tone, right? Like it had to be spooky, but not scary. It had to be, and also the main character had to be never afraid of what was going to happen.
Okay.
Like that was the thing that was going to work. Like it had to have this tonality of spookiness, but the main character could never, never, never be scared of whatever it was. So then once I realized that that's what had to happen, I was like, oh, so the main character, Naya, she likes Jumbies and she wants to find one. She wants to see what they're all about. And so she sneaks out of her bed at night. She sneaks out of her house and goes into the forest to go find Jumbies because she wants to find them. And so we sold that one as sort of a crossover between Jumbies and we're going on a bear hunt. And so that's how that one worked. So she goes by, she sees this creature and she's like, well, you're sort of like a Jumbie. Like, this is what a Jumbie is like. And you seem like you are this creature. And every single time they're like, no, that's not me. We got to keep looking. And so they just keep going and she keeps meeting these creatures. And every time she's like, well, you seem like this particular kind of Jumbie. And every time the creature's like, no, that's not me.
No, I think you got it wrong.
Yeah, this doesn't sound like me. Let's just keep looking, and so that's how the whole thing is. And I think the fun for little kids there is, they're learning about all the various creatures, right? It's not scary because even though they're meant to be scary, the creatures are never scary, and they all like sort of are going off, like together, and they like, it's a band that gets bigger and bigger and bigger as the story goes on.
Oh, I love it.
And also, what Amber does in the illustrations is she sort of sets it up in a way where it's kind of hidden at the beginning, and then it's revealed. So like the kid can like look for the Jumbie along with Naya. Like, can you spot it in the illustration? So it's very interactive in that way. It was very clever.
Yeah.
The way that she set it up.
There's an aspect to picture books that is about a child rereading the book, right? So I think there's probably something fun about them coming back to the book for a 15th time and being like, well, I know what's really going to happen, and like kind of following that. Like it's a clever construct that you've put together.
Yeah. Amber was very smart about this. And then there was something else that I did not even realize until much later on was that the size of the Jumbie increases as the book goes on, too. And she didn't have to do it that way. Like, she didn't. She could have made other choices. I did start with the smallest Jumbie, and I did end with like one of the largest Jumbies. So that's true. But the ones in the middle, like, she didn't have to increase their size incrementally like that, but she did. And that was something that somebody else pointed out to me
Mm.
afterwards. Like, I didn't even notice that myself. Funny enough, just this weekend, I was at a book festival, and there was a kid who was reading it, and his mother picked that up right away. She's
Oh,
like, "Oh, they seem to be getting bigger every time." I was like, "Oh, look at that."
I love children's book illustrations and
Mm.
the ways that they interact with text and tell so much of the story as well. I think I admire the people who are able to do that.
For sure.
It's
Yeah.
exciting.
That's a very particular skill.
Yeah, it really is. I'm curious what you're going to do, if anything, with this memory of thunder and thunder. Do you have plans for this?
I do. At the moment, I have been thinking about the ways that I, as a child, came to understand myth and sort of have wonder about myth. And I was trying to come up with a way for me to write about my childhood and how that dovetails with, like fairy tales and mythology and things like that. And I feel like the Thunder story is one of those that really feels like it was my real life, it's my real memory, but it very much dovetails with this idea of this sort of fantastic idea of thunder becoming thunder.
Mm,
And I have like other things like that, other memories that are similar to that, where I associate a sort of regular kind of mundane thing with something that is much bigger and much more fantastic than it actually is. And so I was thinking about, like, do I do that as sort of like a memoir kind of situation where I can write these sort of smaller stories and you can sort of understand how I come to where I am now. Like, these are the things that I did as a kid from 0 to say 10 or 0 to 12, and that sort of informs who I am now as a writer?
mm,
Or do I write those stories individually and they become something else? Like, it makes a lot of sense for me, especially with the Thunder story, that could be a story by itself. Like, that could be a picture book, like,
mhm.
all alone. So I'm still tooling around with those ideas and trying to figure out where they might fit in to my writing life. But yes, I definitely want to do something with that story of thunder and see where that lands me. So I could not tell you how pleased I was when you reached out and you wanted to talk about this, because I had that story like right in the front of my mind. I was like, this is the thing I'm gonna
Mm.
talk with Dan about.
Yes. And I'm so happy you kept me in the dark about it, the mystery of what Tracy is going to bring to the table today, because usually I'm just like in prepping for these conversations. I'm like, okay, so here we're gonna go with here, we're gonna go there. But I was like, I'm gonna fly with it. And I appreciate that you allowed me to sort of do that too. Do you have anything coming out on the horizon that you want to promote, tell people about?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So I have two novels that come out next year. One comes out in August. It is called Moco Magic Carnival Chaos. So it's part of right now what is a planned duology. They will both be called Moco Magic. So the first one is called Carnival Chaos. It's about a family of Moco Jumbies. So this is a very different kind of Jumbie. These are the stilt walkers during carnival who like
Mm.
get dressed up
Oh
and
yeah,
dance.
the tall figures.
So they come out, they dance around, and it comes from this West African tradition of Mokos as healers who bring joy and happiness and health and so on. And so I'm connecting that to both to, forcibly bringing Africans to the Americas, but also to the idea of Mokos as healers as they were in West Africa, and sort of imbuing these cousins, again, a band of cousins, with the characteristics of Mokos. So one is a healer, one is a seer, and one is a protector. And so they have some shenanigans on Brooklyn, on Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn.
I used to live on Eastern Parkway.
Yeah,
I know that parade.
Yeah. So that's when everything sort of like comes to a head, is during the parade on Eastern Parkway. So there's that one that comes out in August. And then in the fall, I think maybe November, I have another fantasy coming out. It's called Boy 2.0. And this one is about, it's kind of a reverse Snow White, where there is a boy who is held up at gunpoint, and his skin is able to turn him invisible. And he's trying to figure out whether or not he has been genetically engineered, because they are now, after it happens, suddenly there's these scientists and these military people who are after him. And he finds out that they in fact have been studying this, and he's in foster care, so he has no idea who his parents are or anything like that. He believes that he has been genetically engineered, and he needs to figure out what exactly is going on before the scientists and the US military catch up to him. And that really has everything to do with like Black Lives Matter and who is worth what and whatnot in society. But of course, once again, that's not what I'm talking about in the story at all. I'm just talking about this kid who's like trying to figure it out.
Oh, those sound really, really wonderful. I can't wait. I can't wait to check them out.
I'm super, super excited about both of these books. Like, first of all, I worked my behind off on these two books, like getting them both at the same time. I don't know how it happened that both of them are coming out like so close to each other. It just wound out that way. But yeah, I worked my behind off, but I love them so much. Like they're very different, and I really adore them. So I'm super excited for them to be out in the world.
Well, congratulations. I think people are going to be, very excited to check those out, as I am. So I wanted to thank you one more time for taking your time to come and talk with me, and for keeping me in suspense, and for all of these really fascinating, interesting Jumbie tales. I just appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Tracey Baptiste. If there are any teachers or librarians out there listening to this, I definitely recommend you look into getting her to speak to your students. Our conversation kind of made me wish I had some kids, so I could have them improv their own Jumbie fight club. Again, Tracey's books are aplenty, and the Jumbies series is super fun. Check it out for some creepy island adventures. Like and subscribe to Our First Fears if you wish. But what I'd really appreciate instead is, if you like what I'm doing here, tell a friend or a stranger to check us out. Also, I'd love some reviews, even a few words to let others know what you enjoy about Our First Fears would be like a spooky little gift to me. And I do love gifts. As for social media, look for @OurFirstFears, one word. You can also reach out at ourfirstfears@gmail.com. If you do want to get in touch, let me know. What would a map of the backyard paths of your childhood look like? If you've listened this far, I guess I'll also mention that my latest books, Tales to Keep You Up at Night and More Tales to Keep You Up at Night, are currently available from Penguin Workshop. If you pick up a copy or two, let me know you heard about them here on Our First Fears, and I'll send you a signed book plate, I guess. Thanks again for your precious time. I'm Dan Poblocki, wishing you sweet dreams and pleasant nightmares.